Chapter 1 The Night of Flight from the Abyss, the Scent of Betrayal. Rosamund Barry had come to realize in her darkest hour, invariably tasted of damp ashes, a cold gray shroud of dust that settled silently and relentlessly over the most cherished, golden memories of a lifetime. Inside the grand and spectacularly opulent drawing room of the Barry family's townhouse in Mayfair, the warm amber light from expensive beeswax candles flickered and danced against the walls draped in rich crimson damask silk, casting spectral, undulating shadows upon the intricately carved plaster ceiling above. The atmosphere within was thick with the refined, floral perfume of French lavender, seamlessly mingled with the heavy, rich aroma of meticulously polished mahogany, a signature olfactory combination that proclaimed the vast wealth and undisputed social prominence of the family to the London ton during the height of the season. Yet to Rosamund this suffocating grandeur felt like nothing less than an invisible, coarse hemp noose tightening inexorably around her throat, robbing her of even the shallowest, most desperate breath. She stood entirely alone in the center of the chamber, her slender hands clasped tightly together beneath the worn tulle of a pale evening gown that was out of fashion by several seasons. Around her, the aristocratic faces that had once smiled upon her with such warmth, praising her late father. The royal botanist now offered only cold, estranged stares thick with resentment, unspoken accusations, and utter disdain. Lord Alistair, her stepfather, whose gaunt, angular visage and narrow, beady eyes bore an uncanny, chilling resemblance to a venomous serpent, took a slow, deliberate step forward upon the priceless Aubusson carpet. In his hand he held a small amber-colored glass vial, within which a dark purple liquid rested as silently as a sleeping curse. His voice rang out across the room, sharp, dry, and dripping with malice, cutting cleanly through the hushed murmurs of the assembled society ladies. Ladies and gentlemen of the family council, I beg you to look upon this. This is the pure extract of the deadly nightshade, a lethal poison discovered hidden directly beneath Rosamund's bedchamber mattress. This girl has used the botanical knowledge bequeathed to her by her late father to poison her own unfortunate mother, all in a desperate, greedy bid to seize control of the southern herbal garden chain. His false, cruel accusations fell upon the room like heavy, crushing hammer blows, shattering what little dignity and honor remained to her. Outraged whispers began to spread throughout the drawing room like a swift, deadly pestilence, the soft rustling of silks and the clicking of ivory fans providing a rhythmic accompaniment to the rising tide of condemnation. Lady Westmoreland raised her elaborate lace-embroidered feather fan to cover her mouth, her eyes narrowing as she leaned in to whisper to her neighbor about the utter moral degradation of the Barry family's daughter, her head shaking in feigned pity. In the dim, candlelit shadows of the room, the sharp quills of the gossip columnists moved with frantic speed over rough parchment, eager to transform her name into a public laughingstock for the entire London ton in tomorrow morning's scandalous edition of the Morning Post. Rosamund could hear venomous, cruel words like murderess, and a fiend disguised as an angel hissed softly by the very people she had once affectionately called aunts and uncles. They cared absolutely nothing for the truth of her mother's passing. They only craved a sensational scandal to discuss over their afternoon tea, and more importantly, they wished to see her completely ruined, so that Lord Alistair could easily distribute the Barry family fortune among his loyal supporters, cementing his own hold on Mayfair society. Rosamund did not weep. She absolutely refused to grant her enemies the satisfaction of witnessing any sign of weakness. She did not fall to her knees to beg for mercy for a crime she had never even conceived of committing, let alone carried out in reality. Instead, she stood tall and straight, her slender shoulders squared with the quiet, defiant pride inherent in her noble Barry blood. Beneath the lining of the worn wool cloak, she clutched tightly against herself, her fingers brushed against a small, cold metallic object, the key to the chest containing the Sterling Rose Charter. This was the true legacy her father had left her before his sudden and suspicious demise. It represented a vast chain of royal botanical gardens worth over £150,000, sprawling across the south of England. She was fully aware of Lord Alistair's dark ambitions. He had slowly, systematically poisoned her mother by mixing small doses of arsenic into her morning Earl Grey tea, only to cast the blame on Rosamund the moment the poor woman drew her final breath. He intended to lock her away in a dismal asylum, or force her into a marriage settlement with his co-conspirator to usurp the Sterling Rose Charter, for under royal decree, the charter could only be legally validated if she married a duke. The agonizing grief of her mother's death, and the horrific betrayal of her stepfather burned like a searing fire in Rosamund's breast. She recalled the bright mornings she had spent, walking with her father through the estate's greenhouses, inhaling the clean, earthy, and aromatic scents of fresh herbs while listening to him explain the unique, complex properties of each bloom. Her father had always told her that plants never lied, and that only the hearts of men were filled with dark, treacherous traps. Now that very same noble botanical knowledge was being twisted by her enemies into a weapon to destroy her life. When Lord Alistair ordered 2 burly footmen to step forward and seize her, Rosamund acted with extraordinary, desperate resolve. Backing up toward the tea table, she gathered all her remaining strength and hurled a heavy crystal flower vase onto the cold marble floor. The resounding crash, accompanied by the stagnant sour odor of old water spilling across the room, created immediate chaos among the elegant ladies, who shrieked in terror. Seizing upon that fleeting, chaotic moment of confusion, Rosamund turned and ran toward the rear exit of the townhouse, plunging headlong into the torrential rain and howling wind of a London storm. The icy rainwater immediately drenched her chestnut hair, washing away the delicate cosmetics of a meaningless, vanity-filled season and stinging her pale skin like tiny needles. She fled through the muddy, dark streets of Mayfair, the hem of her evening gown dragging through the filth of the city, as she cast terrified glances behind her, half expecting to see Lord Alistair's henchmen emerging from the fog. She had no money, no protector, only a fierce will to survive, and the priceless botanical knowledge in her head. Using the last few coins in her pocket, she secured a cramped, freezing seat on a mail coach heading north, escaping London and the malicious, cruel gossip of the ton. The grinding of the carriage wheels on the wet gravel, combined with the steady, rhythmic downpour against the wooden roof, sounded like a dirge for her former life as a lady. Gazing through the window, she watched the lights of London fade into the darkness, vowing to herself that she would return one day, not as a fugitive, but as a judge to punish those who had ruined her family, restored the Barry name, and exposed Alistair's dark deeds to the world. Her final destination, after several exhausting, sleepless days and nights of travel, was Yorkshire, a wild, cold region shrouded in thick winter mist. Here, barren hills covered in withered heather stretched endlessly beneath the grey, freezing skies of northern England. Yorkshire was entirely removed from the vanity, noise, and deceit of the capital, making it the perfect sanctuary for a hunted woman whose reputation had been ruined by false accusations. Rosamund decided to change her name to Rose, discarding her aristocratic identity as a daughter of the Barry family. She made her way to the desolate Winterbourne estate, where a grim grey stone castle stood solitary among old pine trees swept by the wind. Winterbourne Castle wore a somber shroud of mist that clung to its stone walls like white mourning bands, presenting a scene of tragic, mysterious beauty. She applied for the position of a garden maid, under the supervision of the strict old housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, who was looking for additional hands to work in the estate's greenhouses. Her new duties commenced in the bitter, freezing early mornings, when frost still clung in thin, sharp shards of ice to the dark leaves of the heather. Rosamund was tasked with tending the greenhouses behind the castle and distilling lavender and rosemary oils for the estate's use. In the dim, quiet cellar of the greenhouse, she worked for hours on end beside an ancient, gleaming copper still. The scent of hot steam rising from crushed rosemary leaves, the damp soil and the sharp pine resin mingled with the smell of wax used to polish the tools, creating a peculiar, soothing fragrance. This was the only world that offered her a true sense of safety and quiet freedom. She carefully adjusted the copper valve, listening to the steady, rhythmic drip of liquid into the glass receiver. Each condensed drop of essential oil was a testament to her quiet endurance. She cleaned the seedling trays, turned the soil, and sowed new seeds with her own hands, finding solace in nurturing small signs of life in the depths of a harsh, unforgiving winter. As her delicate hands, once accustomed only to holding fine quill pens and embroidering silk, became calloused, dry, and cracked by the winter frost and rough soil, Rosamund felt her deeply wounded soul find some measure of peace. She lit the furnace under the copper still herself, carefully adjusting the heat so that the steam would pass through the copper coils, to condense into the purest, crystal-clear drops of oil. She learned to read the crackle of the fire, the simmer of the water, and the changing scent of the distillation over time. She realized that, though cast out by polite society, she could find her own worth in these simple, honest tasks. She was no longer the weak, coddled Lady Rosamund Barry of London. She was actively becoming Rose, a practical, independent, and fiercely proud woman. The other servants of the castle watched her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. They found the new maid far too quiet, her manners far too refined, her posture straight as she walked, and she possessed a remarkable knowledge of plants that even the head gardener, Thornton, and the oldest gardeners did not share. She knew how to use distilled valerian root to ease the chronic insomnia of the elderly servants in the drafty cellar, and how to mix sage powder with wild honey to soothe the dry winter coughs of the young kitchen maids. Yet Rosamond kept her distance, never joining the gossiping circles around the warm kitchen hearth. She knew that a single slip in her refined accent or aristocratic habits could expose her whereabouts to her stepfather's spies. At night, lying on her narrow straw bed in the cold barn, she wrapped herself in her father's old coat, inhaling the faint scent of cedarwood from the wool to find strength. She knew she must remain patient and gather her strength. She had to wait for the right opportunity to seek justice for her mother and restore the honor of the Barry name, even if her future now seemed as bleak as the mist shrouding the Yorkshire Valley outside. Chapter 2. A meeting in the blizzard. The Yorkshire winter was merciless, a season that descended upon the moors like a ruthless, icy blade, ready to sever the thread of life from any wild creature in its grasp. On a tempestuous night toward the end of December, a furious blizzard swept across the wind-ravaged valley, bringing shrieking, bone-chilling gales from the Arctic north. Snow fell in dense, suffocating flurries, completely obliterating the boundary between the dark earth and the heavy sky, burying the vast expanses of heather and the cobbled stone paths beneath a cold white blanket that lay several feet deep. Inside the grand greenhouse of the Winterbourne estate, Rosamond Barry was intently focused on keeping the fire burning within the coal hearth. It was crucial to preserve the warmth for the delicate jasmine seedlings and the rare lily bulbs recently arrived from the south. Within the sanctuary of the glass walls, the air was warm, redolent with the rich, earthy scent of damp compost, the sharp tang of pine resin, and the sweet fragrance rising from the green jasmine leaves under the dim glow of an oil lamp. She gently brushed her fingertips over the foliage, feeling the fragile life she was shielding from the howling storm. She knew that if the hearth failed for even an hour, all her dedicated labor would be reduced to frozen ash. Suddenly rising above the howling wind against the Gothic-arched glass panes, an unusual sound caught Rosamond's attention. It was the distinct sound of heavy, stumbling footsteps crunching through the deep snow, followed by the loud crash of a trellis collapsing near the wild rose garden just outside the greenhouse. She froze in her tracks, her heart hammering against her ribs like the frantic beat of a war drum. Without a moment's hesitation, she seized her storm lantern, unlatched the heavy wooden door, and stepped out into the freezing darkness. The tempest assaulted her instantly, whipping icy snow across her face and threatening to extinguish the feeble light of the lantern. Shading her eyes against the blinding flurries, she strained her vision to locate the source of the strange disturbance. Through the flickering, uncertain glow of her lantern, Rosamond discerned a tall figure collapsed on the frozen ground, his back resting against the thorny, skeletal branches of a wild rose bush. The man wore a sodden dark blue naval officer's greatcoat, its brass buttons encrusted with frost that glittered under the lantern light. His face was deathly pale, his sharp, aristocratic features, which looked as though chiseled from stone, now frozen and stiffened by the biting cold. His eyes were tightly closed, and his chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged gasps as he struggled for breath. Rosamond felt a jolt of recognition. This was Julian Sterling, the blind, imperious Duke of Winterbourne, a man of solitary and terrifying nature, of whom the servants spoke in whispers of dread when night fell. It was his custom to wander the estate alone at night, regardless of the weather, but tonight, the poison in his veins had robbed him of the strength to return to the castle on his own. Hurriedly placing the lantern onto the snowbank, Rosamond knelt beside him. As she leaned in close to check his respiration, her exceptionally keen sense of smell was instantly alerted. Beneath the smell of freezing snow and damp wool, she detected a highly distinct and perilous scent emanating from his warm, albeit weak breath, a metallic odor of rust combined with the faint, bitter almond fragrance of wild aconite, a potent poison typically employed to coat weapons or orchestrate assassinations. This lethal toxin was currently constricting his blood vessels and causing his heart rate to spike dangerously before failing completely. Struggling to rise, Julian's large hand clawed at the empty air in search of support, accidentally gripping Rosamond's wrist with a force so fierce it made her wince and tremble with pain. His voice, deep and rasping, carried a dangerous threat: "Stand back. Who dares?" Even in this near-death state, blind and helpless, the combative instincts of a former naval commander surged within him, transforming him into a wounded, dangerous beast. "Please, Your Grace, compose yourself. I am only here to assist you," Rosamond said, her voice soft but steady, carrying a strange, reassuring calm amidst the wild fury of the blizzard. She was well aware that any panic at this critical juncture could cost them both their lives. Summoning all her strength, she attempted to guide the Duke's tall, heavy frame toward the warmth of the greenhouse. She had to brace herself to support a significant portion of his weight, her boots sinking deep into the heavy snow, while her breath came in rapid gasps that mingled with the shrieking wind. At last she managed to haul him inside and settled him back against a long oak bench near the glowing embers of the coal stove. Without losing a single moment to hesitation, Rosamond began to administer emergency treatment, using her extensive knowledge of botany. She knew that if they were to employ the conventional medical practices of London physicians, such as purging or bloodletting, Julian would undoubtedly perish tonight from sheer exhaustion and cardiac failure. Swiftly crossing to her distillation table, she retrieved a glass vial containing a concentrated blend of lavender and valerian root oils, which she had personally distilled. She dropped a few drops of the extract onto a clean cloth and held it beneath Julian's nose, prompting him to breathe deeply. The soothing scent of lavender immediately acted upon his nervous system, dilating his peripheral blood vessels and easing the immense pressure in his violently constricting chest. Next, she reached for a vial of belladonna extract diluted to a precise, delicate ratio, a substance that was highly toxic in the wrong dosage, yet functioned as a miraculous antidote, when administered correctly, to revive a failing heartbeat. Dipping her finger to take a tiny amount of the liquid, she gently applied it to the Duke's neck and temples. The poison coursing through his veins was slowing his heart rate to a lethal degree. The active compounds in the belladonna would work as a direct antagonist, stimulating his heart to beat steadily once more. She watched his expression closely as she worked, her own heart pounding with anxiety. She knew that a single miscalculated drop could turn her from a savior into a murderer. A low groan escaped Julian's throat, and his chest began to rise and fall with greater regularity, his breathing gradually becoming deeper and easier. The long scar running down his neck flushed red before slowly returning to its normal hue under the detoxicating effects of her herbal remedies. His eyes slowly opened, but their focus was entirely vacant, a dull, cloudy gray film covering the pupils of the proud former naval commander. He had been temporarily blinded by the ruthless toxins that had ravaged his optic nerves in a naval battle years ago, and the severe blizzard had triggered a reaction of the dormant poison. Though unable to see the face of the young woman hovering over him, his other senses were heightened to an extraordinary degree as the toxins began to disperse. He heard the soft whisper of her breathing, the rustle of her simple woolen skirt, and above all, he inhaled a pure, crisp scent of jasmine, as refreshing as spring rain mingled with the damp earth of the greenhouse. It was a fragrance entirely distinct from the heavy, costly perfumes favored by the fashionable ladies of the ton in London. Once more Julian's hand reached out into the darkness, locking onto Rosamond's hand, which was rough from manual labor. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice cold and searching, yet betraying a vulnerability he could not hide against the enveloping darkness. "This scent, what have you done to me?" Rosamond gently unclasped his large fingers one by one, carefully modulating her voice to strip it of any aristocratic refinement to avoid raising suspicion. "I am merely a garden maid at this estate, sir. You had collapsed out in the wild rose garden. I only applied a little herbal oil to ease your breathing against the cold. The storm outside is raging fiercely. You should rest here until your attendants search for and locate you." Julian fell silent, tilting his head slightly to catch the subtle cadences of her speech. There was a refined, elevated quality in her tone that contradicted the rustic speech she adopted to conceal her identity. Furthermore, the poison in his body, which the finest royal physicians in London had failed to cure, was yielding to the herbal drops administered by this garden maid. He could feel his heartbeat slowing, pulsing with a steady strength he had not felt in years. The darkness around him remained thick and cold, yet in that obscurity her scent of jasmine served as a singular beacon, keeping his consciousness from the abyss. He wished to question her further, but profound exhaustion overwhelmed him, dragging him down into a deep, dreamless slumber. Even in sleep, his fingers remained tightly wrapped around a corner of her worn coat, as if terrified she would vanish into the stormy night. Rosamond gazed down at his face as he slept. His fierce, menacing expression had dissolved, leaving only a sense of profound isolation and pain that stirred a complex, inexplicable emotion in her chest. Chapter 3. The Marriage Settlement. The next morning, the weak Yorkshire dawn filtered through the towering windows of the study at Winterbourne Manor, casting pale shafts of light across the room. The golden beams illuminated walls draped in heavy oak paneling, onto which hung ancient military maps, detailing long-forgotten battlefields and rusted naval cutlasses from glorious sea battles. The room was steeped in a rich scent of aged parchment, beeswax polish, and the sharp, acrid draft of coal smoke rising from the black marble fireplace. Julian Sterling sat in absolute stillness behind his massive mahogany desk. His sightless, cloudy gray eyes stared unblinkingly into the empty air before him. Under the morning light, the jagged scar slicing across his neck appeared darker, a grim testament to past battles. Even with his vision stolen by poison, the inherent authority of the Duke of Winterbourne enveloped the study like an oppressive, silent weight, a pressure that made others hesitate to draw a full breath. Standing at his side, Brooks, the elderly butler, reported in a low, apprehensive tone that betrayed his quiet anxiety. "Your Grace, the housemaid Rose from the greenhouse has been brought to the study, just as you instructed." "Leave us, Brooks, and see that the door is shut," Julian commanded, his low, resonant voice carrying an unyielding authority that betrayed not a shred of emotion. When the heavy oak door clicked shut with a dry thud, the study plunged into absolute silence. Julian tilted his head slightly, his ear catching the faint rustle of fabric. Though his eyes remained useless, his highly refined sense of smell instantly registered the delicate, pure scent of jasmine that entered the room. It was the very same fragrant perfume that had tethered his slipping consciousness back from the precipice of death the previous night. A cool balm that offered a brief respite from the scorching fire of the wild aconite poison. Rosamond stood before his vast desk. She wore a simple faded gray woolen gown, her head bowed in the customary deferential posture of a maidservant, yet her emerald green eyes silently scanned the formidable man before her without showing any trace of fear. She was acutely aware of the perilous situation she was in. If Julian were to discover that she was, in truth, Rosamund Barry, the fugitive currently hunted in London under the accusation of poisoning her own mother, she would be handed over to the law without delay, and her life would end in a cold prison cell or upon the gallows. She focused on regulating her breathing, keeping her steps light and quiet, ensuring not a single sign of nervousness escaped her poise. "You are no ordinary housemaid, Rose," Julian said, breaking the heavy silence. He rose from his chair with slow, deliberate grace, using his walking stick, capped in silver and engraved with the sterling crest, to guide his steps around the massive desk. He came to a halt mere steps from her, inhaling deeply to confirm the scent she carried. "The way you move lacks the heavy, shuffling gait of common servants. The skill with which you dressed my wounds and prepared the belladonna last night proves you were educated by a true scientist." And more importantly, Julian leaned closer, his head bending near her ear as his voice dropped to a low, menacing whisper. "My informants in London have just sent word that Lord Alistair is hunting relentlessly for the stepdaughter of his late wife, a girl of extraordinary botanical genius who recently fled the capital. He has offered a bounty of £500 to anyone who locates her. Do you happen to know where she might be hiding, Rose?" Rosamund clenched her fists tightly within the folds of her coarse wool skirt to prevent any visible trembling, forcing her voice to remain flat and humble. "I do not know of whom you speak, Your Grace. I am merely a destitute refugee who traveled to Yorkshire, seeking honest employment to keep body and soul together. The remedies I administered last night were nothing more than simple folk medicine taught to me by my late father." "Do not play the fool with me, Rosamund Barry," Julian countered, his utterance of her true name causing her to gasp and take a sharp step backward. "I do not require sight to perceive the truth. My senses of smell and hearing are far sharper than those of ordinary men under heaven. I detect the rare scent of southern jasmine on your skin, a blossom cultivated exclusively in royal gardens under the sterling rose charter. And I know you are afraid, your rapid heartbeat betrays you. However, you need not fear. I have no intention of surrendering you to Lord Alistair for a paltry £500. I hold only contempt for smugglers of his ilk, and know he is behind the treasonous plot to sell military-grade poisons to foreign enemies." Julian turned away, pacing slowly toward the large windows to catch the weak Yorkshire sunlight. "The poison in my blood is the work of a traitor in London, administered during a naval battle. It ravages my body day by day, and I require someone with a genuine mastery of botany to fashion a cure, not the useless royal physicians. Furthermore, the crown grows suspicious of my health. Should the king learn that I am blind and dying, they will strip me of my naval command and freeze the Winterbourne estates under the strict terms of entailment. I need a duchess by my side to deceive the ton during the upcoming season, a wife who will accompany me to social events, using her perfumes and medical skill to fabricate the illusion of my health before foreign diplomats. They must believe I remain strong, buying me the time I need to expose the true traitor." He turned back to face her, his cloudy eyes focusing unerringly on the sound of her breath, as if he could read the secrets of her soul. Therefore, I propose a mutually beneficial transaction, a marriage settlement. You shall marry me and become the lawful Duchess of Winterbourne. I will offer you the absolute protection of the sterling name, settle upon you a pin money allowance of £50 a month, and grant you a social standing so elevated that neither Lord Alistair nor the magistrates will dare touch you. In exchange, your duty will be to concoct an antidote for me, manage the estate's greenhouse to cultivate the botanicals needed to mask my condition, and maintain absolute secrecy regarding my blindness. This marriage shall remain entirely in name only, a legal shield to protect us both. You shall have your safety and title, and I shall have my life. Rosamond remained silent, her mind racing as she carefully analyzed the proposal. Julian's offer was indeed the perfect sanctuary. Becoming the Duchess of Winterbourne would not only grant her absolute legal immunity from her stepfather's ruthless search, but more importantly, this union would activate the provisions of the Sterling Rose Charter, left by her father. As a peeress of the realm, she would possess the wealth and political influence necessary to present evidence of Lord Alistair's crimes directly to the king in London. This was her sole opportunity to obtain justice for her deceased mother and restore the tarnished honor of the Barry family name. I accept your terms, your grace, Rosamond said, her tone shedding its rustic facade and returning to the clear, elegant and proud voice of a well-born lady of the Barry family. However, I must insist on an additional clause in this marriage settlement. You must grant me sole and absolute control of the southern greenhouse, and no one, neither your butler, nor the estate servants, nor indeed you yourself, shall interfere with my distillation experiments. I must have complete freedom if I am to discover your antidote. A faint, enigmatic smile touched Julian's lips, softening the harsh lines of his angular face with a hint of dry amusement. The bargain is struck, my lady. Brooks has already drawn up the parchment. You need only sign your name. He stepped back to the desk, placing his finger upon the signature line of the marriage settlement, which was stamped with the crimson wax seal of the House of Winterbourne. Rosamond approached, took up the quill, and slowly penned her name beside his bold signature. She knew that from this moment on, her life was irrevocably bound to the fate of this cold, sightless duke, and a new battle for survival within the ranks of the Ton had officially begun. Chapter 4. A new home, new rules, and a cold dinner. Their wedding was a hurried, somber, and entirely private affair, conducted in the small, weather-beaten grey stone chapel, situated at the desolate edge of the sprawling Winterbourne estate, under the sole witness of the local vicar and the elderly butler, Brooks. There was no trace of typical bridal grandeur, no magnificent gown draped in expensive Brussels lace, nor the celebratory applause of the London Ton. Instead, the only music was the desolate howling of the winter wind, as it whistled shrilly through the ancient crevices of the stone walls, accompanied by the cold, heavy scent of burning beeswax candles. When Julian took Rosamond's freezing, trembling hand to slip the heavy, ornate gold family heirloom ring onto her finger, she felt an unexpected warmth radiating from his large, calloused hand, a stark and puzzling contrast to his glacial, unyielding demeanor. They exchanged no tender vows of affection. Rather, they silently traded the grim terms of a marriage settlement designed for sheer survival. Thus, Rosamond Barry officially crossed the threshold of Winterbourne Manor as the new Duchess of the Sterling line. Yet, the welcome awaiting her at the grand manor house was chillingly cold, fraught with deep-seated suspicion and distance from the long-serving household staff, who stood like frozen statues in the draughty hall. As Rosamond stepped through the massive ancient oak doors of the castle's great hall, she immediately felt the weight of critical gazes, cold contempt, and hushed, venomous whispers passing among the assembly of servants lined up to welcome her. They had already heard rumors of the Duke marrying a garden maid of obscure origins. Leading the staff was the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a stern-faced, middle-aged woman dressed in a rustling black dress stiff with the discipline of an iron-ruled life. Mrs. Gable looked at Rosamond's simple, worn grey wool dress with a thin, humorless smile, offering a reluctant, patronizing bow. "Welcome, your grace. I have prepared your bedchamber in the West Tower, far from the Duke's private quarters, in accordance with his grace's explicit instructions. This castle is governed by strict, ancient rules left by the late Dowager Duchess, and I trust you will soon familiarize yourself with them to avoid any transgressions. The staff here is not accustomed to serving someone who worked in the gardens, but we shall do our duty." Her words carried a sharp, unspoken implication. Rosamond was merely a temporary surrogate, a garden maid selected as a convenient tool, rather than a true duchess worthy of this noble house, and she would soon be discarded. Rosamond betrayed no sign of anger. Looking directly into Mrs. Gable's cold eyes, she squared her shoulders and replied in a calm, Steady voice. Thank you, Mrs. Gable. I trust that within your many years of management, the castle will run smoothly without requiring my intervention in every detail. Please have me shown to my room. Her quiet, dignified composure made the housekeeper hesitate, and the condescending smirk faded slightly, though the underlying suspicion remained. The chamber in the west tower was bitterly cold and drafty. The old oak floorboards creaked under her weight, and the faded blue velvet furniture was covered in a thin layer of gray dust that rose in tiny clouds at her touch. From the arched stone window, she could see the barren Yorkshire hills stretching endlessly into the thick gray fog. No fire had been lit in the hearth, a silent, deliberate punishment from Mrs. Gable to test the new Duchess's patience and resolve. Refusing the help of the young maid sent to assist her, Rosamond began putting away her clothes herself, wanting to establish control over her own space and keep her secrets safe. Their first dinner as husband and wife was served in the castle's grand dining room, an ancient and drafty space that echoed with the ghosts of the past. It was a vast, cold chamber, with a soaring vaulted ceiling from which hung tarnished bronze chandeliers covered in black soot and years of neglect. The flickering candlelight on the dining table did little to banish the deep, heavy shadows enveloping the corners of the room, obscuring the family portraits of the sterling ancestors looking down from the walls. Rosamond sat at one end of the 20-foot-long oak dining table, while Julian sat at the opposite end. The distance between them was so great that they seemed to inhabit separate worlds, divided by a silent, cold ocean of distrust, with only the cold space of the empty table stretching out between them. An eerie, suffocating silence pervaded the grand dining room, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire in the hearth. Not a single word of polite conversation was exchanged between the newly wedded couple, who sat like distant strangers at opposite ends of the universe. The only sound was the dry, cold scrape of silver cutlery against the Wedgwood porcelain plates, echoing through the cavernous space like a slow, rhythmic death knell for any hope of romance. The smell of cold roast beef and boiled potatoes mingled with the damp, heavy scent of beeswax candles and the musty odor of the old oak-paneled walls, creating an oppressive atmosphere that weighed heavily on Rosamond's chest, making each breath a conscious effort. She looked toward Julian at the other end of the table, under the guttering candlelight, noting the tense set of his shoulders. Despite his temporary blindness, he handled his knife and fork with absolute precision and elegance, guided by the sharp hearing and spatial awareness of a former military officer, who refused to show any sign of dependency. His face was as cold and unyielding as Yorkshire ice, showing no awareness of the wife sitting opposite him, his thoughts locked away behind a mask of indifference. This icy distance was a silent, powerful warning of the clear boundary between them. This was a transaction, and she must expect no warmth, tenderness, or affection from him. Rosamond felt a wave of absolute isolation wash over her, but she steeled her heart, determined not to break under his coldness, remembering that she was here to survive, to clear her family's name, and that his life was now linked to hers. Following that stifling and lonely dinner, Rosamond could not bring herself to rest in her freezing, drafty bedroom in the West Tower. Carrying a brass hurricane lantern, she stepped out into the snowy Yorkshire night to find escape from the castle's suffocating atmosphere. Walking along the snow-covered paths, she reached the castle's old greenhouse, which had been locked and sealed for 10 years since Julian's mother passed away. The large Gothic arched glass doors were overgrown with dry, thorny vines and covered in years of accumulated dust. Rosamond unlocked the door with her key and stepped inside. Under the weak light of her lantern, she saw a scene of complete neglect and decay. Precious porcelain pots lay broken on the ground, wild rose bushes grew through broken glass panes under the winter wind, and dry ferns were covered in gray cobwebs. The air was filled with the musty smell of long-abandoned soil, rotting leaves, and the freezing dampness of the Yorkshire winter night, yet she felt a strange sense of relief. Yet for Rosamond, this overgrown and forgotten place was a true treasure for her survival. Beneath the chaos of the weeds, she saw rare medicinal plants still surviving, and ancient rose seeds that could be cultivated to distill essential oils for Julian's treatment. She placed the lantern on a decaying wooden workbench, rolled up her woolen sleeves, and began cleaning the room alone, finding comfort in the physical labor. Using a small hand scythe, she carefully cut away the dry, tangled branches of wild briars, gathered the sharp shards of broken porcelain, and tilled the damp soil to prepare for planting. Her hands were soon black with dirt, and the frost-bitten cracks on her fingers began to bleed, stinging painfully in the freezing Yorkshire winter night, but she ignored the physical pain, focused only on the seeds of hope that lay dormant beneath the surface. Every weed pulled was a step toward securing her position, a small victory in her quiet war against Alistair. She breathed in the scent of damp earth and crushed stems, feeling her spirit rise as she took charge of this small corner of the estate. As she struggled to move a heavy stone planter, a weathered, wrinkled, yet surprisingly strong hand reached out to help her. It was Thornton, the old head gardener, who had served the Sterling family for 30 years. He looked at her dirt-covered hands, then into the steadfast emerald eyes of the new Duchess, and sighed softly. "Your Grace, you should not be doing this hard work. This greenhouse has been dead and abandoned for 10 years, since the late Duchess passed." Rosamond wiped the sweat from her brow and smiled warmly. "Nothing is truly dead if the earth still holds the seeds. Thornton, I need this greenhouse working again to help the Duke. Could you help me prepare some compost and organic fertilizer tomorrow morning?" Seeing her deep botanical knowledge and genuine respect for gardening, Thornton bowed his head. "I will prepare everything for you, Your Grace." The old gardener's loyalty was the first alliance she gained at Winterbourne Manor, and she knew that from this ruined soil she would grow new life, new hope, and her own power to change her fate. Chapter 5. A silent jealousy in the night of high fever. A fortnight had passed in a blur of quiet adjustment since their hasty, unadorned marriage, and the sprawling, windswept estate of Winterbourne now prepared to welcome its first distinguished guest of the year, Viscount Ashley, a young nobleman of striking countenance, pleasant demeanor, and elegant manners. The Viscount was a well-known amateur botanist among the local gentry. He had traveled to Yorkshire ostensibly to discuss the complex boundary divisions of the farming lands in the valley with Julian, but his attention was quickly captured by the greenhouse situated behind the castle, which had been miraculously restored to life by the delicate hands of Rosamond, who had worked tirelessly to revive it. Having heard rumors of the new Duchess's passion for botany, Ashley had brought a small wooden box containing a rare silver fern, collected during his recent travels to the south, as a polite offering to his hostess. That afternoon, beneath the pale, feeble rays of the winter sun, Rosamond was instructing Ashley in the art of distilling pure essential oil from valerian roots inside the warm, fragrant greenhouse. She wore a simple moss-green wool gown, her face flushed by the heat radiating from the active copper furnace. She spoke with natural confidence, her voice clear and elegant, filled with wisdom as she explained the plant's biological properties. "You see, Ashley, the roots of the valerian must be harvested at dawn, when the morning frost has not yet fully melted, for that is when the active compounds that soothe the nervous system reach their highest concentration and purity." Ashley stood close to her, listening intently to her explanations, his eyes filled with the sincere admiration of a kindred intellectual spirit. He laughed softly, a warm, youthful sound that echoed pleasantly in the humid, soil-scented air of the glasshouse. As they bent together to inspect the bubbling copper alembic, the physical distance between them narrowed, assuming a familiarity that was somewhat closer than the strict dictates of polite society normally permitted. Julian sat upon a large wooden chair on the stone gallery connecting to the greenhouse, pretending to enjoy his afternoon tea. His clouded gray eyes were directed toward the distant foggy valley, but his sharp hearing, honed as a naval commander, was focused entirely on the greenhouse. He heard Ashley's light laughter and Rosamond's clear, passionate voice, a confident tone she never used with him inside the cold castle. He could hear their footsteps moving together, the turn of a copper valve, and the rustle of dry leaves being crushed between their fingers. Every sound was magnified in his mind, fueling a quiet irritation that burned in his chest. Julian's black-gloved hand gripped the silver handle of his cane so tightly that his knuckles creaked in the silent air. A sharp, burning discomfort flared in his chest, a subtle, unfamiliar jealousy that he had never experienced in his life. He felt excluded from her world of light and knowledge, which he could not share in his blindness. He resented that his wife, by marriage settlement, shared her botanical expertise and warm laughter so freely with another gentleman, while maintaining a cold, polite distance with him. He felt like an intruder in his own home, watching from the dark as they shared a connection he could never hope to touch. It was a bitter realization that his own limitations had built a wall between them, shutting him out from the warmth she so easily offered to others. He was the Duke of Winterbourne, yet in this moment he felt utterly powerless. "Brooks," Julian called out hoarsely, his cold, commanding voice cutting through the pleasant chatter from the greenhouse. "Bring the Duchess inside immediately. It is time for dinner, and tell Lord Ashley his carriage is prepared at the gate." His abrupt, commanding tones silenced the greenhouse, creating a tense and awkward atmosphere. Ashley glanced at Julian's dark expression, bowed to Rosamond, and took his leave with hasty politeness. Rosamond stepped outside, looking at Julian with questioning eyes, but he turned away before she could speak, leaving her alone on the stone path as he retreated into the shadow of the castle. That night, another fierce blizzard descended upon the Yorkshire Valley with destructive fury, shaking the very foundations of the estate. Winds howled outside the windows of the Duke's bedchamber, throwing freezing sleet against the glass. The wild aconite in Julian's body, activated by the sudden cold, flared up more violently than ever, constricting the blood vessels around his heart. Near midnight, Rosamond was awakened by the frantic knocking of Brooks outside her chamber in the cold west tower. "Your Grace, please come to the Duke's room immediately. He is suffering from severe chest spasms and a high fever, and the doctors do not know what to do." The panic in the old butler's voice was unmistakable, sending a shiver of fear through her. Rosamond quickly threw on her father's old wool cloak, grabbed her herbal medicine chest, and hurried through the cold corridors to Julian's chambers in the East Tower. The large room smelled of cold sweat, medicinal spirits, and pine wood burning in the fireplace. Julian lay on his four-poster bed, draped in the dark blue velvet curtains of his family line. His face was contorted in agony, veins bulging on his sweat-slicked forehead. His chest heaved in violent spasms, his breath ragged and gasping as if he were dying. He was fighting the ghosts of his past, remembering the naval battle where he was betrayed and poisoned. The atmosphere in the room was thick with dread, as though death itself were lurking in the shadows, waiting to claim him. Rosamond felt her heart tighten with fear as she approached. "Away, stay back, all of you," Julian muttered in his dark delirium, his hands thrashing blindly in the air and knocking over the bedside table, shattering a crystal glass on the stone floor. The servants and doctors stood back in terror, their faces pale in the firelight, none of them daring to approach the blind War Duke in his feverish fury, fearing the strength of a commander who still fought his old naval battles in the dark. They watched him helplessly, frozen in their spots, unable to offer any relief. "Leave this to me, all of you must step outside, and see that you prepare additional basins of hot water and clean linens immediately." Rosamond commanded, the dignity of a true duchess clear in her voice. She approached the bed, showing no fear of his feverish thrashing. Kneeling at the bedside, she gently but firmly held Julian's trembling hands, trying to calm his violent movements. Her touch was steady and warm, offering a physical anchor to his drifting mind. Her presence brought a sudden, quiet resolve to the chaotic room, and the doctors and servants quickly obeyed. She began to unbutton his sweat-drenched shirt, exposing his broad, muscular chest marked by battle scars from shrapnel and swords, remnants of his brutal years of naval warfare. Full of glory and pain, Rosamond felt a deep sympathy looking at these wounds on his body. Taking a warm cloth soaked in water with camphor and lavender oil, she gently wiped his body to bring down his rising temperature. Then she quickly prepared a warm extract of valerian and wild ginseng, feeding it to him spoon by spoon to soothe his racing heart and ease his dry throat, watching carefully for any sign of recovery. Using her soft but firm hands, she rubbed a warm camphor and licorice oil blend onto his chest to relax the muscles constricted by the aconite. She felt his muscles tense under her palms, then slowly relax as the warmth absorbed into his skin. As she worked, she whispered soft, comforting words, just as her father had done when she had nightmares as a child, hoping the gentle tone of her voice would pierce the dark fog of his pain. She was tireless, focused entirely on his recovery, ignoring the cold draft in the room. Through the dark fog of his delirium, Julian suddenly smelled the familiar, fresh scent of jasmine wrapping around his burning body. That sweet fragrance chased away the metallic smell of the poison in his mind, bringing a miraculous sense of peace. He reached out blindly for the source of the scent, and when he touched Rosamond's hand, he gripped it tightly as if it were a lifeline. He pulled her toward him with sudden force, causing her to lose balance and fall forward, her face coming to rest mere inches from his. Julian narrowed his sightless, clouded eyes, buried his face in her neck, and breathed in the jasmine scent of her skin to soothe his burning fever. He held her close, refusing to let the comforting warmth escape him. "Do not leave me," Julian whispered in broken, desperate gasps, his voice stripped of the Duke's usual cold authority and pride, leaving only the vulnerability of a soul tormented by darkness. "Stay here by my side, do not leave me alone in this darkness." In his delirium he spoke of his ship, cannon fire, and the betrayal of a junior officer. Rosamond listened, piecing together his whispered words to understand his past. She realized that beneath his terrifying, cold exterior was a man carrying the heavy burden of duty and betrayal. Every word he muttered painted a picture of a man who had been deeply hurt, yet had never allowed himself to show it to the world, hiding behind a facade of stone to protect himself. It was a revelation that touched her deeply. Rosamond remained completely still in that awkward, intensely intimate embrace in the dead of the freezing winter night. She could feel his hot, rapid breath brushing against the sensitive skin of her bare neck, and the strong, erratic pounding of his heart beat close to her own chest through the thin fabric of her nightgown. A strange, warm sensation of tenderness and fluttering emotion began to filter into her guarded heart. This feared, cold Duke of Yorkshire, who trusted no one and ruled with a firm hand, turned out to possess a wounded, lonely soul that longed for protection in the silence of his life. She did not pull her hand away from his desperate grasp. Leaning against the carved oak bedpost, she gently stroked his dark hair and whispered words of comfort to him throughout the stormy night. Under the flickering warmth of the firelight, their shadows merged into one upon the cold stone wall, and the boundary of distrust between them cracked, paving the way for a slow-burn romance in the harsh Yorkshire winter. Chapter 6. A Dreadful Formula and the Wall of Ice. The botanical greenhouse situated in the remote western corner of the Winterbourne estate was thick with warm steam and the heavy, earthy scent of damp soil, dried pine needles, and lavender bubbling in a polished copper alembic. Outside, the wild Yorkshire blizzard raged, casting ferocious gusts that rattled the thick, frost-patterned panes. Rosamond Barry stood in absolute silence beside a rustic oak workbench, her slender fingers trembling slightly as she held a delicate glass pipette. She was isolating the toxic components from the dark blue liquid she had surreptitiously gathered from Julian Sterling's poisoned goblet the night before. The amber glow from the hearth flickered across her delicate features, carving shadows of tension upon her brow. Her focus was absolute as she drew a deep breath, allowing her keen sense of smell to dissect each vaporous layer arising from the heated vessel. The vapor bore a deceptively cloying sweetness like wild forest honey, yet carried a vile bitterness that left a sharp, metallic sting upon the tongue. It was the lethal combination of wild aconite and copper salts, a deadly decoction capable of arresting a man's heart within a matter of hours if untreated. Suddenly Rosamond froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her ash-gray eyes widened in sheer horror. This aroma, the structure of the precipitate, and the manner in which the toxin bound itself to red blood cells. Everything aligned perfectly with the research journals of her late father. With trembling limbs, she crossed the stone floor to the wooden chest containing her father's effects. Retrieving a brass key sewn into the lining of his old traveling coat, she unlocked the chest and turned the yellowed pages of the notebook, where the familiar, elegant handwriting of her father had sketched the botanical structures of Mediterranean herbs. A page dated exactly 10 years prior caught her eye. It detailed a formula intended as a pain reliever and heart stabilizer for Royal Navy sailors who suffered trauma. In the margins, her father had written in faded red ink, "This compound must only be administered in infinitesimal doses to preserve life. Should the concentration of wild aconite be increased tenfold and synthesized with antimony metallic salts, it will transform into a colorless, odorless phytotoxin that systematically ravages the nervous system and induces temporary blindness before ultimately claiming the victim's life. It is a weapon of absolute destruction and must never fall into malevolent hands." Rosamond felt an icy chill wash over her body, her pulse hammering fiercely as if to burst from her chest. She realized that the poison Julian had ingested during the skirmish off the coast was no coincidence. It was a perilous variant derived directly from her father's medical formula. Rosamond's chest tightened with paralyzing dread, a cold sweat breaking out along her hairline. Her cruel stepfather, Lord Alistair, was the mastermind behind the military poison smuggling ring Julian was investigating, a man whose greed knew no limits. The black-hearted Lord Alistair had undoubtedly murdered her father to seize these research papers, and now he was using the refined formulas for his own treasonous gains. Now the villain was employing her father's formula to poison the Duke of Winterbourne, turning a life-saving science into a tool of death. If Julian realized that the toxin which had nearly cost him his life and left him temporarily blind originated from the Barry family, would he not suspect her father of treason against the crown? Would he not look upon Rosamond with suspicion and disdain, seeing her as an enemy? He might easily conclude that their marriage settlement and her arrival at Winterbourne under the guise of a helpless garden maid was a calculated conspiracy designed to continue poisoning him and hide Alistair's crimes. Such suspicion would utterly shatter the fragile trust blooming between them, destroying any chance of happiness. She could not permit him to discover the truth, yet she could no longer face him with the warmth she had previously shown, fearing her own guilt would betray her. Rising to her feet, she gathered the papers and her father's notebook, locking them securely in the chest. Though her eyes brimmed with tears, they shone with a painful, desperate resolve. To shield Julian from suspicion and preserve her father's honor, Rosamund determined that she must erect a cold wall of ice between herself and the Duke. That afternoon, she summoned the butler, Higgins, requesting all her personal effects be moved immediately from the master bedchamber in the east wing to solitary, stone-walled quarters in the castle's west tower. She asserted that she required absolute solitude to focus on distilling the antidote for his grace without distraction. The elderly butler, Higgins, was astonished and concerned, yet seeing the determination in the young duchess's eyes, he could only bow respectfully and carry out her commands. Dinner that evening was served in the cavernous dining hall of Winterbourne Castle, enveloped in a suffocating and ominous silence that seemed to chill the very air. The massive black oak table, spanning a distance of 15 meters, was set with only 2 bowls of warm barley soup and 2 glasses of claret under the flickering, ghostly light of the candelabra. Julian Sterling sat rigid posture at the head of the table, his formal black attire accentuating his broad, commanding frame and sharp, aristocratic jaw. Though his eyes remained bound beneath a tight bandage of linen gauze, the former naval commander's sharp hearing immediately detected the subtle alteration in his companion's breathing and tentative movements. Rosamund sat at the far end of the long table, her simple gray gown blending into the shadows of the ancient stone chamber. They dined in absolute silence, save for the howling blizzard outside the windows and the occasional clink of silver against porcelain. The palpable coldness and physical distance of the long dining table served as a grim metaphor for the invisible barrier rising between them. Julian set his heavy silver fork down against the porcelain plate, his deep, resonant voice cutting through the heavy silence. "Rosamund," he said, his tone demanding yet laced with quiet concern. "Why have you moved your quarters to the west tower?" Rosamund flinched slightly, her fingers tightening on the linen napkin in her lap. She fought desperately to keep her voice level and devoid of warmth, refusing to betray any hint of her inner turmoil. "Your Grace," she replied coolly, "the west tower has windows that receive a steady draft of wind, which is highly advantageous for drying botanicals. Furthermore, synthesizing your antidote requires that I labor late under candlelight, and I have no desire to disturb your rest and recovery." Julian narrowed his eyes behind the linen gauze, noting the distance in her formal address of Your Grace, rather than using his Christian name as she had recently begun to do. His keen sense of smell, sharpened by his lack of sight, detected the faint scent of ash and bitter herbs from her direction, replacing the sweet jasmine that usually lingered about her person. A heavy tightness gripped his chest, and a wave of apprehension washed over him. "You are keeping a secret from me, Rosamund," he said, his voice dropping to a low, husky growl. "Last night, when the poison flared up, I did not find your warmth beside my bed. You are deliberately avoiding me. You imagine things, Your Grace," Rosamund said, rising slowly from her chair and offering a polite, distant curtsy to signal the end of the conversation. "I am merely adhering to the terms of our marriage settlement. I am to prepare the antidote to preserve your life, and you, in turn, are to afford me protection from Lord Alistair. There is nothing more to our arrangement. If you will excuse me, I must return to my laboratory in the West Tower to oversee the distillation of the herbs." She turned and departed swiftly from the dining hall, the hem of her gown sweeping across the cold stone floor with a dry, lonely rustle that echoed in the vast room. Julian Sterling remained seated at the head of the immense table, his hand gripping the crystal glass so tightly that his knuckles turned white, and the glass threatened to shatter in his grasp. He felt a profound loneliness returning to shroud the ancient stone manor, a darkness far deeper than the blindness that covered his eyes. The wall of ice Rosamund had erected did not merely separate their physical bodies. It was actively suffocating the prideful Duke's heart, leaving him in the absolute darkness of suspicion and unspoken agony. He wanted to call her back, to demand that she stand by his side, but his stubborn pride kept him silent, staring into the dark. Chapter 7. The tempestuous journey to the capital. The brutal winter in Yorkshire finally showed signs of waning, yielding to heavy mists and melting snow that formed muddy streams along the wild hill roads. The chill enveloping Winterbourne Castle arose not only from the northern weather, but also from the cold silence between the Duke and his Duchess for several weeks. Rosamund remained secluded in her West Tower study, working tirelessly to refine herbal distillations and sending antidote samples to Julian through the butler, Higgins. She refused private meetings, maintaining the strict decorum of a contractually bound servant, avoiding any physical contact or unnecessary conversation. Their delicate, slow-burn relationship seemed to have frozen at a painful impasse. Julian Sterling grew increasingly taciturn and irritable, his moods darkening with each passing day. The jagged scar across his chest and the persistent poison smoldering within his body frequently flared up, inducing agonizing chest contractions during the night. He was fiercely determined not to allow her to witness his physical vulnerability, yet he desperately yearned for her warmth and the soothing melody of her gentle voice. Amidst this simmering tension, an urgent letter from their London solicitor arrived at the Winterbourne estate. Lord Alistair had formally lodged a complaint with the royal household and the Foreign Office, accusing the Duke of using unlawful military authority to detain his late wife's stepdaughter and seize her assets. He threatened to raise the entire matter before the House of Lords during the opening of the upcoming season, to ruin Julian's reputation. Julian stood by the tall, arched window of his grand study, his knuckles white as he clenched the crumpled letter in his fist. He knew he could no longer remain hidden in the safety of Yorkshire. He had to bring Rosamund back to the capital to confront their mutual enemy head-on, and resolve the military poison smuggling case once and for all. Moreover, the season was when the ton gathered in its entirety. Only by using his supreme authority and ducal status could he openly shield her from the cruel scrutiny and malicious gossip of high society. "Higgins," Julian called out, his deep, commanding voice echoing through the silent spaces of the study. "Prepare the grand traveling carriage of the family. We depart for London tomorrow morning, and inform the Duchess that she must pack her belongings. She shall travel with me." When Rosamund received the news from Higgins, a soft, anxious sigh escaped her lips. She knew that London was the very center of Lord Alistair's power, the place where she had been falsely accused of poisoning her mother and driven away in deep disgrace. Returning to the capital meant confronting the merciless whispers of the ton during the height of the season, as well as her stepfather's relentless pursuit. Yet she also understood that this was the only path to resolve the matter and clear her name. Quietly, she packed her most precious essential oils and her father's wooden chest, then stepped into the massive carriage bearing the sterling coat of arms, which waited at the castle entrance. The arduous 3-day journey from Yorkshire to London proved to be an immense physical and emotional trial for Rosamund. The enclosed dark mahogany carriage, lined with luxurious black velvet cushions, jolted persistently along the muddy, slush-filled roads. Within the confined and suffocating space of the carriage, Rosamund sat quietly by the window. Her fingers softly caressed the folds of her worn cloak, while her eyes watched the bleak, snow-draped pine forests and barren fields recede into the distance. Sitting directly across from her was Julian Sterling. He leaned back against the carriage wall, his sightless blue eyes concealed beneath a thin strip of gauze, his stern expression reflecting the dim shadows of the compartment. The silence between them stretched for hours, growing so heavy that the only sounds were the iron-bound wheels, grinding against the rough gravel road, and the wind whistling through the doorframe. From time to time, Julian's brow furrowed. Even without sight, he could sense Rosamund's shallow breathing and the visible tension in her body opposite him. He wished to speak and shatter the heavy silence, to ask why she had become so cold and distant, but his stubborn ducal pride and habitual reserve held him back, keeping his lips sealed. On the second night of their journey, the carriage was forced to seek shelter at a remote coaching inn on a windswept hillside, as a sudden, late-season blizzard blocked the road with deep snowdrifts. They were accommodated in a small room with a stone fireplace. That night, the cold weather and the exhaustion of the trip caused the poison within Julian to flare up violently. He collapsed onto the simple wooden bed, his chest contracting painfully as he gasped for air, cold sweat drenching his brow as he fought the agony. Hearing his low, suppressed groans from the adjacent room, Rosamund could no longer restrain herself. She pushed the door open, carrying a basin of warm water and her special bag of distilled herbs. Kneeling by his bedside, she gently unbuttoned Julian's shirt to apply the herbal oil and soothe his racing pulse. As her soft, cool fingertips brushed against his burning skin, Julian shuddered, his large, calloused hand suddenly reaching out to clasp her wrist in a tight, desperate grip. "Rosamund," he rasped, his warm, uneven breath brushing against her cheek. "Do not go, do not leave me for the West Tower again." Rosamund's heart tightened with a sharp ache. She looked down at the chiseled face, now contorted in agony, of the most powerful peer of the realm, who lay helpless before her, pleading for her presence. Patiently, she wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, placed a warm compress over his chest, and gently comforted him throughout the long, dark night. Though she had tried to maintain her icy distance during the day, in the shadows of this winter night, her deep affection and care overcame all her rational defenses. By morning, the storm cleared, and the carriage resumed its southward journey. As the red brick buildings and coal smoke of London appeared on the horizon, both of them understood that their quiet life in Yorkshire had come to an end. They were entering the perilous battlefield of the season, where their honor and their very fate would be decided before the eyes of the Ton. Chapter 8. Calamity in the Park and the Duke's shielding cloak. London greeted their arrival with its magnificent splendor. Yet beneath the glittering facade lay an undercurrent of malicious whispers marking the commencement of the season. Within the opulent Sterling townhouse in Mayfair, calling cards from the nobility accumulated upon the polished silver salver. Yet behind these polite gestures of invitation lay the sneering curiosity and cold disdain of the Ton, directed toward the newly wedded bride of the Duke of Winterbourne. Gossip columns were rife with rumors, speculating how the blind Duke had been bewitched by a mere Yorkshire gardener, who had supposedly used base sorcery to secure her elevation into the prestigious Ton. To shield his wife from the malicious prying eyes of the gentry, Julian had requested that Rosamond remain within the quiet townhouse, avoiding the busy city centre. However, Rosamond was acutely aware that she could not hide behind closed doors forever. On a spring morning when the London fog had just dispersed, she resolved to walk in the peaceful expanse of Hyde Park to seek fresh air and procure botanical specimens from the local flower markets. Wearing a simple gown of grey wool and pulling a deep hood low to shield her delicate face, she hoped to blend unnoticed into the morning crowd. During the peak of the social season, Hyde Park in the morning was the epicenter of aristocratic socialization, where elegant ladies paraded in magnificent carriages to exchange the latest scandalous gossip and aristocratic rumors of the town. As Rosamond strolled near the tranquil Serpentine, the sudden, aggressive clatter of horse hooves shattered the peace, coming to an abrupt halt beside her. An opulent carriage bearing the family crest of Lord Alistair swerved sharply, blocking her path and cutting off any avenue of escape. Lord Alistair stepped down from the carriage, his face flushed with anger and triumph. For days he had set his henchmen to watch the Sterling townhouse, waiting to corner her. He marched toward her, his small, bulging eyes gleaming with cruelty. With a sudden violent movement, he snatched the hood from her head, exposing her beautiful, startled face to the harsh morning light and the scrutiny of the surrounding aristocrats. "Rosamond Barry, you lawless, thieving wretch," Lord Alistair bellowed, intentionally projecting his harsh voice to draw the attention of the surrounding crowd. "You fled from your family's estate after poisoning your own mother to steal the sacred Sterling Rose Charter. Members of the Ton, look upon her. This is the vile, illegitimate creature who used a false identity to deceive the Duke of Winterbourne into marriage, all in a desperate bid to escape her crimes." The surrounding crowd of aristocrats halted immediately, forming a wide circle. Shocked gasps and murmurs arose from the ladies, who raised their lace fans to cover their mouths, sneering in derision. Cruel remarks were aimed directly at Rosamond. "Good heavens, is she indeed the rumored murderer?" One lady whispered. "What an absolute disgrace to the noble house of Sterling to welcome a filthy gardener as a duchess." Another sneered, her tone dripping with venom. Rosamond stood tall and straight, amidst the jeering crowd, her fingers trembling as they clutched the small reticule containing her father's botanical research. She felt utterly suffocated, her face losing every drop of color under this public onslaught. She longed to defend herself, to expose Lord Alistair's own crimes of smuggling poison, but she knew that the cynical Ton of the prestigious season would never believe the word of a powerless girl over a peer of the realm. Thus she stood, isolated yet proud, enduring the tempest of social humiliation with quiet dignity. "Release her," a deep resonant voice, laced with a chilling authority, sliced through the air from the edge of the crowd, instantly plunging the park into absolute silence. The onlookers turned, parting to create a path. Julian Sterling descended from a magnificent black town coach, emblazoned with the golden falcon crest of the House of Sterling. Although his eyes were still concealed beneath a thin band of gauze, and his hand grasped a black oak cane, the towering silhouette of the former naval commander exuded an authority that made everyone present catch their breath in fear. Without a word of unnecessary explanation, Julian walked directly to Rosamond's side. He unclasped his heavy fur-lined cloak, gently draping its warmth over her trembling shoulders, and drew her close against his chest, offering her shelter before the entire assembly of London's elite. He turned toward Lord Alistair, his face cold and unyielding as carved marble, and though his eyes were hidden behind the gauze, his gaze locked onto the villain with terrifying intensity. "Lord Alistair," Julian's voice boomed across the silent park. "You dare accuse this lady of theft? It seems you have forgotten that she is now the lawful Duchess of Winterbourne, under the laws of this realm. Our marriage settlement has been approved by the High Court of London and the House of Lords. Any slanderous words or physical aggression directed against her shall be deemed a direct assault upon the honor of the House of Stirling. I will employ the full weight of my military influence and my family's personal solicitors to bring anyone complicit in defaming my wife before the highest royal court." Lord Alistair's face paled to a sickly ash, and he stammered in terror under the Duke's steel-cold threat. "But, Your Grace, she stole the charter. From this day forward, her identity and her standing are defined by me alone." Julian cut him off, his voice slicing through the air with absolute finality. He made his grand declaration of protection for all the assembled guests to hear. "She has no need to prove her worthiness to anyone, for from this day forth I am her worthiness." With tender care, Julian desisted Romond into the carriage, leaving Lord Alistair standing utterly humiliated amidst the very crowd of aristocrats, who were now turning their amusement upon his public defeat. The carriage rolled smoothly away, leaving a massive wave of shock throughout the London season, regarding the blind Duke's fierce, unconditional protection of his wife. In the warmth of the carriage cabin, Rosamond gently rested her head against Julian's shoulder, her tears falling silently onto his rich fur cloak. She knew then that no matter how cruel the world outside might be, this strong chest would remain her safest fortress, shielding her life forever. Chapter 9: Decoding the Poison Before the Royal Court. The grandest royal banquet of the Foreign Office was held within the magnificent hall of Whitehall, illuminated by the glow of thousands of crystal beeswax candles suspended from the soaring, gilded ceiling. The glittering elite of the London season had assembled in their finest attire, with proud marquises and peers standing in complacent groups, their low murmurs of political gossip echoing across the vast hall. The Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and the special royal envoy representing the Crown sat at the table of honor, at the far end of the banquet hall, to witness the signing of crucial international treaties. Rosamond Barry appeared at the side of Julian Stirling, looking exquisite in a gown of rich emerald green satin, adorned with delicate rose lace embroidery that caught the candlelight. Her noble, poised carriage and striking beauty drew the immediate gaze of every guest in the room, her very presence commanding silent admiration. However, the tranquil atmosphere was abruptly shattered when Lord Alistair, accompanied by a stern detachment of the Royal Gendarmerie, strode into the great hall. The cruel stepfather had conspired with Julian's political rivals, orchestrating a treacherous plot designed to utterly destroy the House of Stirling. Stepping forward toward the table of honor of the Foreign Secretary and the Royal Envoy, Alistair executed a deep bow of respect before raising his chin to deliver a ringing, public accusation that silenced the entire assembly. "Right Honorable Secretary and distinguished envoy of the Crown, I stand before this assembly to accuse Julian Stirling, the Duke of Winterbourne. He is not only blind and physically incapacitated by disease, rendering him entirely unfit to hold the Royal Stirling Rose Charter, but he has also illegally possessed and smuggled prohibited military-grade poison from the naval campaigns to eliminate his political opponents. The evidence of this lethal contraband lies hidden directly upon his person or his banquet table." An uproar swept through the ballroom, and a storm of critical murmurs rose from the crowd, pointing accusing fingers at Julian. The guards immediately moved to surround Julian Stirling. Yet the Duke stood like an unyielding monolith beside Rosamond, his handsome face frozen in an expression of icy calm, showing no trace of fear in the face of this audacious slander. Amidst this chaos, Rosamond Barry did not falter, nor did she retreat. She noticed that upon the banquet table, Lord Alistair had just raised a glass of wine to offer a toast to Julian, to show his respect before the confrontation. However, using her refined sense of smell, she detected the cloying sweet aroma of wild aconite mingled with the faint, metallic tang of antimony drifting from the goblet. Taking a resolute step forward, she struck the glass from Julian's hand before the astonished eyes of the assembly. She lifted her head to face the Foreign Secretary and the Royal Envoy, her clear, ringing voice carrying across the silent hall with absolute authority. "Right Honorable Secretary and Royal Envoy, the accusation brought by Lord Alistair is a vile and fabricated slander designed to cover up his own heinous crimes. The true culprit who possesses and uses this prohibited military-grade poison is Lord Alistair himself. The goblet of wine he just poured for my husband contains the very same lethal poison that he has secretly administered to Julian for years, causing my husband's blindness and devastating his health." Lord Alistair let out a contemptuous, arrogant sneer, pointing a mocking finger at her as he shouted to the court, "By what right does a low-born gardener's maid stand before the representatives of the Crown to defend this ruined traitor? Where's your proof, girl? I am Rosamond Barry, the only daughter of the late royal botanist, Arthur Barry," Rosamond declared, her clear voice revealing her true identity to the astonished elite of the London season. Drawing a small glass vial of essential oils distilled from wild Yorkshire herbs from her pocket, she bowed gracefully to the royal envoy. "Gentlemen, I request permission to perform a chemical precipitation reaction right here, on this very goblet of wine, to prove the truth." The royal envoy nodded in grave assent, prompted by the intense curiosity and mounting tension that held the hall in its grip. Rosamond walked steadily toward the banquet table, taking the goblet of wine that Lord Alistair had prepared to poison Julian. Uncorking the vial, she allowed 3 drops of the clear botanical solution to fall into the deep crimson wine. The entire sanctique fell into a suffocating silence. No one dared to draw breath as hundreds of eyes locked onto her slender, steady fingers. The moment the final drop touched the surface, a spectacular reaction occurred. The crimson wine instantly began to froth with snow-white foam, sizzling as the liquid shifted from deep red to a sickly yellow-green, before settling into the deep Prussian blue that characterized the precipitation of military-grade toxins. A thin wisp of white smoke drifted upward, releasing a sweet scent like sweetgrass mixed with strong sulfur and the sharp tang of metal corroded by acid. This was the unique precipitation reaction that occurred only when wild aconite and antimony salts met the specific essential oil documented in her father's notebook. The royal physician immediately stepped forward to sniff the vapor, his face turning deathly pale in horror as he reported to the Foreign Secretary and the royal envoy, confirming the presence of this lethal military chemical. "Right Honorable Secretary and Royal Envoy," Rosamond said, her voice sharp and persuasive as it echoed off the high walls. "This Prussian blue coloration and the white smoke are undeniable proof that the wine has been spiked with a lethal military poison. Furthermore, look at Lord Alistair's left hand. The hollow signet ring he wears still bears trace amounts of that same toxic powder within its intricate engravings. He is the one who has secretly poisoned Duke Julian Sterling for years to seize control of the estate, and tonight he intended to use it to murder him, to silence him forever." A murmur of astonishment rippled through the grand hall, the lords and ladies awed by Rosamond's brilliant intellect and her masterful demonstration of toxicology. The sneers of disdain that had previously greeted her were instantly replaced by profound admiration. Lord Alistair's face drained of all color, and he retreated in panic, his eyes turning bloodshot and wild. Desperate to silence her, he lunged forward, attempting to wrench a sword from the nearest gendarme. "I will kill you, you treacherous wretch." But before he could take a step, Julian Sterling moved with blinding speed to shield Rosamond. His navel-dress sword cleared its scabbard with a resonant ring, reflecting the light of the crystal candles. The cold, razor-sharp tip of his blade rested directly against Lord Alistair's throat, freezing the villain in place. The imposing, dangerous aura of the Navy Duke commanded absolute submission, forcing guards and guests alike to shrink back in awe. Julian looked down at the villain with sightless but murderous intensity, his voice ringing out to protect his wife before the Foreign Secretary and the envoy. "She has no need to prove her standing to anyone in this room, for from this day forward, her standing is mine. Whosoever dares to threaten or insult her shall answer to the sword of Winterbourne." The royal envoy rose in absolute fury, his face contorted with anger at Alistair's treasonous plot. He commanded his guards to disarm and arrest Alistair and his co-conspirators immediately for possessing forbidden poison and attempting to murder the Duke. Turning his gaze to Rosamond, the envoy's eyes filled with admiration for her intelligence and courage. He declared before the assembled Foreign Office that the honor of her late father was restored, and decreed that full ownership of the Sterling Rose Charter, valued at £150,000, be returned to her. This brilliant triumph in the diplomatic ballroom forever established Rosamond Barry's position as the uncontested Duchess of Winterbourne within the London season. Chapter 10. The Spring Crown and Complete Healing. The brilliant legal and social triumph during the height of the London season had completely restored the long-slandered honor of the Barry family, returning the exclusive Sterling Rose Charter to Rosamond. The Royal High Court, acting under the direct authority of the House of Lords, had conducted a massive and exhaustive hearing. In the face of the irrefutable evidence presented by the Sterling family's private solicitor, Lord Alistair was stripped of all his noble titles, his illegally acquired wealth was confiscated, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment in a remote colony overseas. His insidious scheme to smuggle military-grade poisons was thoroughly dismantled. Furthermore, his co-conspirators within the Foreign Office and the Royal Mint were dragged into the light of justice. Lady Cecilia Cavendish and the vindictive ladies who had once humiliated Rosamond in Hyde Park now faced merciless social retribution. They were utterly ostracized by the ton, their vouchers to Almack's revoked, and they were permanently barred from the most prestigious salons in Mayfair. The notorious gossip columns that had once defamed her character now published glowing articles, praising the extraordinary intellect and resilient dignity of the new Duchess of Winterbourne. They returned to the wild, windswept Yorkshire estate of Winterbourne, now bathed in the gentle warmth of spring. The ancient stone castle, once a grey and forbidding fortress, no longer loomed with cold gloom. Magnificent hearths in every grand room crackled with robust fires, completely banishing the lingering chill of the harsh winter. The cheerful laughter and lively chatter of the domestic staff echoed merrily through the stone corridors of the West Tower and the East Wing, as they busied themselves clearing the dark passageways, polishing the brass candelabras, and preparing for the upcoming formal wedding. To the north of the valley, the sweeping meadows vibrated with lush green life, and wild roses began to bloom, releasing their sweet fragrance to mingle with the refreshing northern sea breeze. The local villagers and tenant farmers of the estate arrived regularly, bearing baskets of flowers, warm milk, and forest to express their gratitude and loyalty to the compassionate Duchess, who had so selflessly aided them in surviving the cruel winter. With the Sterling Rose Charter safely restored, Rosamond once again possessed legal access to the precious royal botanical specimens from the south. She spent entire days sequestered in the estate's glass greenhouse, patiently distilling and compounding the final, complete antidote from these rare endemic herbs. Though her slender hands were stained with lavender resin and pine oil, her ash-gray eyes shone with a fierce, unwavering hope. She meticulously cross-referenced the detoxification formula with her father's handwritten journal, completely purging the deadly copper salt impurities to yield a clear herbal syrup that shimmered with the rich golden hue of honey. Julian Sterling ingested the antidote regularly each day, and the poison that had long plagued his body began to be gradually eliminated. The chest spasms that had previously tormented his nights subsided significantly, and his heartbeat returned slowly toward a normal, steady rhythm. On a bright spring morning, as warm sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of the grand study, Julian Sterling sat quietly in his antique oak and leather armchair. Today was the momentous day when the linen bandages that had shrouded his eyes for many long months would finally be removed. The atmosphere in the great room was so profoundly quiet that one could distinctly hear the gentle sigh of the spring wind whispering through the gardens outside, and the anxious breathing of Higgins, the old butler who stood waiting near the window. Rosamond stepped closer to him, her breath carrying the familiar delicate scent of pure jasmine, which instantly worked to soothe the subtle tension in Julian's posture. Her soft, slender hands rose to the back of his neck, gently brushing against the knot of the linen bandages. "Julian," Rosamond murmured softly, her voice ringing as clear as a silver bell. "Keep your eyes closed, if you please, until I have completely removed the wrapping. The morning light is exceedingly bright today, and you will require some time to adjust to the glare." Julian gave a slight nod, his muscular frame relaxing completely under her tender, reassuring care. With meticulous gentleness, Rosamond unspooled each layer of the bandage from his forehead and eyes. As the final strip of linen fell away, Julian slowly opened his eyes. At first, the world before him was still a blurry mist of light and shadow, but under the gradual effect of the slowly working antidote, he began to recognize the warm, gentle rays of the spring sun and the soft, hazy outline of Rosamond standing directly opposite him. His vision was not fully restored immediately. It would require months of careful treatment and slow recovery in the days ahead, but even this dim, blurry light was a miraculous triumph. Julian Sterling gazed in wonder at the soft, hazy silhouette of the quiet, devoted wife who had saved his life under the warm spring sun. Rosamond Barry stood there, her soft chestnut hair cascading over her shoulders, catching the golden rays of the sun, and her intelligent ash-gray eyes looking at him with a mixture of anxiety and hope. He rose from his chair, his tall, imposing figure stepping forward to stand before her, and gently lifted her small, delicate hands to press them against his cheeks, feeling the real, comforting warmth of her skin, and directed his eyes, which were slowly finding their way back to the light toward her. "Thank you for coming into my life and distilling its broken pieces into something whole," Rosamond, Julian said softly, his deep, resonant voice rich with profound affection, his eyes shining with absolute devotion. "These eyes cannot see your face clearly yet, but from this day forward they wish only to look toward you. You are, and shall forever remain, the only Duchess of my heart and life." Rosamond offered him a radiant smile, tears of pure joy slipping silently down her cheeks, only to be gently brushed away by his broad hand. The cold distance and painful misunderstandings that had once stood between them dissolved entirely, like winter frost melting beneath the warmth of the sun. Together they had traversed the deepest shadows of betrayal to welcome the bright dawn of a new life. Their formal wedding ceremony was celebrated with magnificent splendor within the wild rose gardens of the Winterbourne estate, blessed by the heartfelt wishes of the domestic staff, local tenant farmers, and royal courtiers who sent their congratulations from London. Rosamond wore a bridal gown of pure white silk satin, exquisitely embroidered with delicate lace depicting the sterling rose. Her hair was adorned with the heirloom diamond and emerald tiara, which Higgins, the old butler, had respectfully presented to her in the presence of their private solicitor. The entire household assembled to bow in deep respect before their proud new duchess, who had utilized her profound botanical wisdom and unyielding resilience to protect the estate and preserve the life of their duke. As a lively waltz was struck up by the local musicians, Julian led Rosamond onto the lawn for the opening dance beneath the golden afternoon sun of Yorkshire. The duke's strong, protective arm held her slender waist securely, guiding her in perfect harmony through the elegant steps as the gathered guests watched in silent admiration. The malicious gossip of the London season was permanently silenced, replaced by a profound respect for the high status and extraordinary talents of Rosamond Barry. Standing beside Julian, she felt an immense pride and boundless happiness. Beneath the starry canopy of the warm Yorkshire night, Winterbourne Castle stood resolute, grand and majestic upon its grey stone hill, the warm light from its many windows casting long, golden fingers across the dark lawns. It was no longer a cold, lonely fortress of isolation and suspicion, but had transformed permanently into a home filled with love, the comforting warmth of glowing fires, and a complete healing for all of life's painful wounds. Inside the quiet bedchamber, two souls who had once been broken, betrayed, and cast aside by the world had now found their true sanctuary in each other's embrace. As the wind whispered softly through the pine trees and the wild roses in the greenhouse below, they stood together at the window, prepared to weather any storm the future might bring, and ready to plant the seeds of an enduring, eternal spring for the noble house of Stirling.